Welcome back, everyone. Uh, Remember, this is a course on basics. So those of you who have been exposed to this material before in one way or another, taking a course, it's just my way of introducing the same material with my own perspectives added and how I feel the material is best presented. So we're now getting to the heart of Henry George's analysis and the analysis by political economists generally. And that is this whole issue of what are these things called factors of production? And we got a little bit down this road last week. And, the factors of production, there are three of them, at least in our analysis: land, labor, and capital, meaning capital goods. So we'll get into a more detailed discussion of what that means. But in the early writings, even in Henry George's book, he always uses the term capital, but he goes on to define it as tangible goods. So for clarity, I'm starting with the term capital goods, and we'll continue with that throughout the course as I remember to do so. So what's the first factor of production? It's nature. And the term that was given to nature by the political economist was land. And Henry George in his writings said, look, when we think of land, we're not just talking about surface land, we're talking about all of nature. And so we have to think of the natural world as comprising the source of everything that we produce. And logically, just think through that. We cannot produce anything without accessing nature. And that's a fundamental principle that we will be working through as we get into this course. Well, okay, just some examples I gave you last week. So this includes the natural forests. And keep in mind, there's a distinction here. I said natural forests. So what happens if people plant trees? Are those trees part of nature, or are they something else? Just something to think about for a minute. We have natural resource laden lands. Underground, we find all these resources that these lands hold. None of them have been created by us. We make use of them by extracting them from nature, the production process. And then again, we have nature takes all sorts of forms in terms of what's available to us. There are, again, the forests, there are the rivers, there are the seas, there are the oceans, and all of the natural resources that are in the oceans or on the seabeds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have the animal life. When it is in the wild, it's part of nature. Again, another thing to think about. Once we domesticate an animal and begin to raise animals directly through our involvement in agriculture, does that change the relationship we have with animals? We harvest fish from the oceans and from the rivers and from lakes. But what happens when we begin to grow fish in a confined space and then dump them into the water so they can grow? They're no longer wild. What are they? And then last week, I ended up with this slide that shows some of the other natural assets we have access to that may not come to our minds right away. The broadcast spectrum, the paths around the planet where satellites can go, takeoff and landing slots at airports. One of the characteristics of all these natural assets is that they have an inelastic or finite supply. And that inelasticity, meaning we cannot make any more of it than exists in nature. We can change its form, but we cannot make any more of it. And for example, the example with takeoff and landing slots at airports is, again, no two airplanes can occupy the same space at the same time without some disastrous results. And so when we use these inelastic assets, we have to have a system of rationing those assets, allowing access to those assets by human beings in some way that makes sense, that allows for their productive use. And there are moral considerations that come into play that societies have to consider under law. In other words, do we need law? And I think the answer is yes, that guarantees equality of opportunity to access these assets. And that means, do we need to prevent the potential that they are monopolized by some to the exclusion of others? More recently, we've had this major change in technology with the introduction of solar and wind farms to capture sunlight and wind and turn that process into electricity to run our technologies, run our industries, etc. So these are ways that we have created technologies to take advantage of what nature provides freely to us. And the question arises again, is it possible to monopolize wind or the sun? Think about that. And if it's not possible to monopolize the wind or the sun, even though in a sense it has an inelastic supply, the sun emits so much energy, the wind continues, but the wind is here because the planet has dynamics that create wind. Can we create wind on our own? No. Maybe that's arguable, but we certainly have a difficult time creating sunlight. Okay. And the last part of this set of natural assets related to nature has to do with where we live. And that is the parcels of land on which we build our cities and towns, where we live, where we play, where we engage in commerce. And in economics, there's the argument that, well, there's the ability almost always for substitution. In other words, if you're in real estate, what is the three words that you hear from a realtor always when it comes to value? Anybody?
Location, location, location.
Okay. And every location has some attributes that give it advantage over other locations or disadvantage from other locations. And a lot of that has to do with nature. For example, it's really difficult to build in a swamp. It's really difficult to build on the side of a cliff. It's risky to build where there are frequent hurricanes or earthquakes or tornadoes. You might be able to do it, but the location has certain advantages and disadvantages. And in our market system, demand and supply interact to determine what those advantages and disadvantages are converted to in terms of a financial impact. So we looking at our cities, yeah, there's substitution, but the bottom line again is that in the aggregate, we cannot make any more locations than we already have. We can improve the condition of some, and so in the short run, expand the supply of building lots, for example. We drain swamps, we cut down forests, we blow up mountains. We do all of that, and it does increase the supply of locations that might be more suitable for different types of development than when nature provided it. And that brings up another consideration we'll eventually get to, and that is, once you blow up the mountain is no longer as it existed in nature. And so now is a question of, what is that new location? Is it still nature, or is it something else? And we'll have, I'm sure, some interesting discussions when we get to that point. Any questions so far about this, the definition of land? One of Henry George's examples that he gave was how some natural assets can be extracted from nature and then just left alone, and they will change in form over time. For example, if you grow grapes, you harvest those grapes and you put them in a barrel, and I don't know how this happens, but with yeast, it turns into wine, right? And so you leave it alone for a very long time, and it increases in its taste, it increases in its desirability, and so it's been produced by human beings with the aid of whatever equipment they have and whatever technologies they bring to bear on it. So it's a tangible good, but the question is it a tangible capital good, or is it a consumer good? And that's where I think this distinction you're making maybe comes into play. We can talk about that more, but this gets later in the discussion of how in political economy, and Henry George talked about when a good is finally delivered to the market, and it changes from being, let's say, business inventory to now a consumer good. What's the production of a good and how far that goes before it is converted into a consumer good? Is it when it is in inventory in a store, or when it is in the hands of the consumer in his or her home? One of the great important observations that we need to recognize is that nature has a zero cost of production in terms of human labor and the use of capital goods. Thus, nature is appropriately identified by Henry George as the source of what we produce, and it exists independent of human labor. So if we disappear from this planet, nature is going to continue to do what it does. It's going to evolve, over time, and those assets that nature produces will be available for whatever other life forms exist, even if we're not here. So keeping that in mind, we have to look then of, okay, if nature has a zero cost of production, if it's here for our use, then we must be the active factor of production. And we're referred to by political economists as labor. What we produce may not end up being capital goods. It depends on what we do with what we produce. So what we consume immediately doesn't enter into political economy. If I go out into the woods behind my home and I pick mushrooms that are there, and they're not poison mushrooms, and I bring them home and I consume them, there's no political economy activity involved. There's been no pricing of the good. There's been no attempt to market it, exchange it. It hasn't gone through a distribution process. I've just consumed it. But what if I don't consume the mushrooms? I bring them home and I use them to produce some other edible item that I then put a stand out in front of my home and I offer for sale. So I've extracted the mushrooms and other natural commodities. And so I've engaged in labor and I've produced something, and that something is going to be, sold. Now, that box of that whatever container is of the food I produced, is that a capital good? For me, it's my inventory of saleable items, but is it a capital good? Now, if with the introduction of increasingly sophisticated tools and machinery, our capital goods have become extremely efficient, of course. What does that mean? What does efficiency mean? It means for every unit of input of land and labor and capital, there is an increased output per unit of input. That's what we get. That's how we get more goods with constant efficiency. Production processes have also become very specialized, incorporating methods that have required, as Henry Ford taught us, a division of labor into narrower and narrower activities. And we're a long way, and we've advanced a long way even from what Henry Ford could come up with in terms of how new wealth is produced. And we could get into a lot of discussion about what artificial intelligence is going to do to that process. No doubt we're looking to the future, and in fact, the book by Sean Cully that I mentioned talks about this challenge. We're going to have eventually, and we do have already, robots that we produced are now producing new robots themselves, which are producing wealth, which are producing new robots. And so where does the human component come in when we've distanced ourselves so far from the outcome of wealth that's being produced? How much distance is required before human beings no longer have a claim to part of that wealth as wages? I don't know what the future is going to be like with regard to what people are able to earn with their labor, mental and physical, but we certainly have some enormous challenges from a social, legal, moral standpoint to figure that out, so that we still give people an opportunity to reach their own potential and have a decent standard of well-being. I don't know how quickly that's all going to come upon us, but it seems like it's coming awfully fast. But getting back, to how to think about this a little bit, I tried to present a little bit of a different an explanation of which of our activities is closest to nature, which are the primary forms of labor that are involved in production. So we have to look at the closeness of labor's direct application to nature and to natural resources. And so these primary types of labor, I've said, include things like resource extraction, agriculture, timber harvesting, fishing, and hunting. Those are basic activities that involve individuals, human beings, directly applying their labor to nature. You may be able to think of a few other activities that join in that. So once we've done that, once we have done that basic work, that basic type of labor, then the next phase is taking what we've produced and doing something with it to make it more useful. So we engage in milling, refining, combining, and processing. So think of all the steps that occur once we mine coal out of the ground. The next step in all that process to get to where eventually that coal perhaps heats homes, or drives a turbine in a factory to produce goods and services. So that's the secondary level of activity. And then finally, we move on to a third or tertiary level. And this is where we see manufacturing, assembly, and transportation. And those are the final three stages where the wealth gets produced and finally delivered to markets. And then it becomes, the wealth is fully distributed and ready for consumption, whatever that consumption might be. Does that make sense to you, how I've divided up those categories of labor into primary, secondary, and tertiary? Now, here's where it gets even more complex. This is a graph of the U.S. employment by sector. And over time, if you look at this, the big change has been that most of us are now working in the service sector. We're getting compensated for services that we engage in. A lot of those services may not directly result in an increased production of wealth, of tangible goods, whether those tangible goods are capital goods or consumer goods. And so, as our economic system has become more efficient, meaning that the primary and secondary and even tertiary forms of labor involve fewer and fewer people, the question is, well, what about the rest of us? What role do we have in the production of wealth? And depending upon the particular type of work that we do, what our activity is, it could be a considerable amount, or it could be very little. And I'm going to try to go through that a little bit. The first thing to cover is professional services. So keeping in line with the fact that we do require a lot of expertise in the production of goods, and the services that we provide contribute to that in a major way. So a building cannot be constructed without the involvement of architects and engineers. So and the same way with machinery, automobiles, trucks, whatever the machinery is, jet airplanes, all that requires engineers, draftsmen, people with expertise in designing and help fabricating all that is required that eventually is going to go into that piece of equipment. Then you have accountants and lawyers, bankers and financial advisors, as well as insurers. They're all less involved in the securing and in the production process, but they're necessary. Without accountants and lawyers, bankers and financial advisors and insurers, how much of what we produce today wouldn't get produced? Contracts have to be drawn, that have to be clear in the obligations of the parties to the contract. Financing may be necessary, and so there has to be institutions or entities that are organized in order to provide financing, to provide credit, to provide loans, all of that. So none of the people that are engaged in these activities might ever step into a factory or a mine or on a farm, commercial farm, or any farm, but their services are still making a contribution. The division of labor that's developed makes these special services valuable because if they didn't perform, if those of us who perform services didn't perform those services, then the people who were directly involved in wealth production, in that primary, secondary, or tertiary level, they would have to do more. They wouldn't be able to specialize, to apply their labor with the highest use of their skills. They would have to be a jack of all trades, and we would get far less output per unit of labor. And that brings up a real question for us in terms of compensation. How do people justly get compensated for their contributions to the production of wealth? Is it purely by market forces? We have all sorts of laws that impact who gets what. Henry George looked at this issue in his book, and he discusses the value of services in wealth production. And here's what he offered, and here's his sense of this. He wrote, labor always produces either wealth, which may or may not be capital or services. Only in an exceptional case of misadventure is nothing produced. I have a couple misadventures that I'm going to remind us of. I'm thinking of something that where something tangible in terms of a good, a consumer good, was produced that people were unwilling to pay for, and so the cost of production could not be recovered by the sales. And these are two examples that I think tell this tale pretty clearly. Now, the one on the left, everyone know what that was? The automobile, the Ford Edsel, okay? They did all sorts of, pre-production analysis of the market. They surveyed people. What do you want in an automobile? They thought they built the perfect car that everyone would want, and everyone thought it was ugly and no one bought it. However, and this is something that we'll get into later. One of our now gone colleagues at the Henry George School, he spent a lot of time explaining to me how some goods that depreciate over time down to scrap value can eventually have a great deal of exchange value as collectibles. And so the Ford Edsel, most of them were destroyed, but the ones that weren't destroyed and people kept in their garage for 25 or 30 years, handed down to their family or whatever, and were either fully restored. They might, that automobile now that no one wanted when it was brand new, now as a collectible might be sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars because there aren't very many of them left. I don't know about cans of the new Coke, but there's another example where, the producers of Coca-Cola surveyed their customers, and they came up with a new flavor that they thought would sell, and people said, no, thank you. I like the classic Coke and I want my classic Coke. And so they spent a lot of effort, paid wages to all of the people that participated in that. They had to acquire the components of what Coca-Cola is made of, and they put it out in the market, and then they lost a lot of money and they had to regroup. I'll give you a perfect example of a mistake I made. I bought one of the first computers that had a hard drive in it. This is back in the 1980s when there was the Apple one, whatever. And I bought this computer made by a company called K-Pro. And it was the first computer with a 10 megabyte hard drive. And I kept it for a couple of years, and I finally replaced it with something newer. I should have kept that K-Pro. It's now an antique, and it has a collectible value of, I saw one for sale for about $8,000. So, this is all part of the collectible markets. Now, to what extent does the collectible market impact, the larger economy? It has a huge impact. This is a, but the measurement of the goods, for example, that Ford Pinto probably had to be, in order to have a collectible value of any significant number of amount, had to be probably totally stripped down and restructured. So it might have cost the owner that automobile, when it was sold, probably cost $2,500. Then it deteriorated down to zero or very little. And then someone decided, I'm going to restore this automobile. And they spent $15,000 on it, speculating that as a collectible, when they took it to the Barracks auction out in Arizona, that it was going to, give them enough of a return that it justified spending $15,000 or whatever they spent to make it restored. So that's a significant part of the economy. The question, is in this discussion is it still part of the political economy? Because it's gone through its production process, it's been consumed, and now it's a collectible. But the collectible can't stand on its own without the infusion of new labor and new tools and equipment and etc. Okay, so this is really the last issue I want to talk about tonight. If you read almost any economics textbook, Economics 101, they're going to say, the economist is going to argue that there is a fourth factor of production, which is entrepreneurship. That entrepreneurship is a special form of labor and a factor of production in its own right. We are not going to treat entrepreneurship as a separate factor of production. In our study of political economy, the differences in individual ability are treated as the basis for specialization and the division of labor. So just think about it. All of us, we tend to gravitate to what we do best and that we have a natural inclination toward. Thus, given the same access to land and to capital goods, some of us will be more productive than others. Some will devote their time and their labor to business organization and management. Some will obtain a law degree and practice law. Some will obtain a medical degree and practice medicine. And lawyers and doctors may come together and organize into a firm, and they will, run that firm like a business. So they become entrepreneurs, but what they've done really is to become specialists. And many law firms have one member of that firm who's sort of the managing attorney, who handles all the staff and all of the day-to-day business things, as opposed to doing research on legal issues and going to court. And the same thing with a medical firm. A medical firm might have a member of the partnership who's not a physician, but is managing the day-to-day operations of that medical firm. So we have all of these complexities in terms of who does what in any organization. But for our purposes, we're going to ignore the idea that there is a fourth factor of production. So finally, when we talk again about wealth and political economy, we're dealing with the tangible goods produced that serve as a storehouse that we can draw on to combine with other goods or simply consume. Labor applied to land produces something, some form of good, to be counted This is an important part of this discussion. To be counted as wealth, the good must meet certain criteria. And those criteria quickly are as follows. It has to be a product of labor with or without the assistance of other capital goods. It has to have exchange value in the marketplace, and it has to satisfy some human desire. If it meets those three criteria, then we're going to say it's part of the system of wealth. And we'll get into a whole discussion next week about what is and what is not wealth under that set of criteria.